Welcome to Issues That Matter. This morning we're going to have a conversation about Mikhail Gorbachev with Scott Ritter, Diane Sare, and Dennis Speed. So, Scott, I assume that you were in Russia during his administration. So, why don't you start the conversation off?
Well, sure. I mean, look, my introduction to Mikhail Gorbachev uh, began in earnest. I mean, I was a student of Soviet studies, Russian affairs, and I of course followed the Game of Thrones rotation that took place between Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernyenko, and when Gorbachev came in, um, you know, it was a breath of fresh air. This young face, this dynamic individual who was, taking the baton from the old guard, the stodgy old, stagnant Soviet bureaucrats, and he's somebody who promised to shake things up, that he was going to make life better for the Soviet Union. Talked about policies of perestroika, that's restructuring, glasnost, openness, and then he put action to those words. In December of 1987, he signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Um, and to implement that treaty, a Department of Defense activity, the On-Site Inspection Agency, was created. I was recruited into that agency, and in June of 1988, I was sent to the Soviet Union as part of this advanced party of inspectors to prepare sites for the receive inspectors. Where this comes into relation is to Gorbachev is, while I was doing this job, on June 28th, Gorbachev convened something called the 19th All-Party Union Conference. Now, to most people who hear that, your eyes are going to roll and say, "Oh my goodness, that is literally the personification of Soviet era bureaucracy. Nothing could be more boring than that." No, if you study the history of the Soviet Union and what an all-party union conference was, it's an extraordinarily rare event. In fact, the 18th All Union Party Conference was convened in 1941 by Stalin on the eve of the German invasion. There hadn't been one since. And so for Gorbachev to say, "I'm convening this," was a big deal. And what was he doing? Why was he convening this conference? It was a revolution. He was basically starting a revolution to fundamentally change the way the Soviet Union functioned. And the first thing was to liberate Soviet government from the Communist Party. The 19th All Union Party Conference um, set in motion the an election, a general election in the Soviet Union to elect people's deputies, who would create something called the Congress of People's Deputies, who would then create something called the Supreme Soviet of People's Deputies, who would then elect a president who wasn't the general secretary of the Communist Party. Didn't have to be. It was to liberate Soviet governance from the Communist Party. This is a revolution, and I don't think people understood it. I don't think people understand it today. It was revolutionary. Gorbachev's problem, though, is that while he was carrying out this political restructuring, there was a definite need of economic restructuring, and he wasn't up to the task. And the Soviet economy collapsed as he was trying to do this job. When you shake up domestic political systems, opposition comes out. And yes, there was Yegor Ligachev, his deputy, who opposed him, the Communist Party. There's also a guy named Boris Yeltsin, a maverick, who opposed him. Didn't believe that Gorbachev was proceeding fast enough with perestroika, that more changes were needed, and who resented the empowerment of Soviet authority over the empowerment of sovereign republics like Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, etc. So Gorbachev had all these struggles he was going with. He was also facing the United States, which, although under Ronald Reagan was encouraging this, when Reagan passed the baton off to George Herbert Walker Bush, the United States hit the brakes, slowed it down. At a time when Gorbachev needed to show the Soviet people results of this revolution he was trying to bring in, the United States didn't. We didn't sign the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty until July of 1991. Less than 2 weeks after we signed it, there was a coup undertaken by the old guard to oust Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin climbed up on a tank, stopped the coup, brought Gorbachev back, saved his life, but didn't save his political career. On December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev stepped down as the president of the Soviet Union. And that night, the Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin, the tricolor of Russia went up, and the Soviet Union was over. People revile him, despise him in Russia. They hate him. They think that he is solely responsible for the destruction of the Soviet Union. I can't argue with this. I will say that Gorbachev's intent, I don't believe, was to destroy the Soviet Union, but to revive the Soviet Union through this revolutionary process of democracy and change called perestroika. He failed. I think it's clear he failed. But let's think about this failure for a second. What's happening today in the world? We're seeing a radical restructuring of global power, a break away from the unilateralism of American hegemony. What empowered American hegemony? The collapse of the Soviet Union. If Gorbachev hadn't failed and the Soviet Union had revived, we would have been looking at a bipolar world, a bipolar reality that would have extended for some time. The world will not accept singularity or bipolarity. The world demands multipolarity. And Gorbachev's failure, from a historical perspective, set in motions the geopolitical changes necessary to create this moment of transformation. And so hate Gorbachev all you want, but recognize his importance as a historical figure. If it weren't for Mikhail Gorbachev's courage in attempting a revolution that failed, the circumstances would have been set in motion that lead to what I believe is a step in the right direction in the world, a world where all nations are recognized as equals. And I'm not naive enough to believe that we are ready to walk into utopia. There's a lot of struggle that has to take place still. But the fact is, the world is waking up and rejecting the singularity of American hegemony, and this would not have happened at this pace, at this time, if it weren't for Mikhail Gorbachev's dramatic failure in his perestroika revolution.
Diane?
Well, I think he wasn't singularly responsible for the failure. I mean, there was the policy, as people know, I worked with LaRouche, who was very involved in this period of proposing a strategic laser defense to Reagan, and that the idea was the Soviet Union adopted at the same time, because you could not have such a balance where only one side had it. And the point of this also was an economic and a science driver. It was rejected at the time by the Soviets, and LaRouche warned that the Soviet Union was going to go bankrupt and disintegrate. When the Berlin Wall came down, which also was extremely, as LaRouche's widow, who is German, said, imagine having lost 27 million lives to the Nazis. The reunification of Germany would not necessarily be so obvious. And the fact that Gorbachev agreed that this could happen, and that NATO, James Baker III, promised explicitly that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, was rejected. But then further, LaRouche was in prison at the time, but what he and his wife proposed is, why don't we take this incredible moment where people were elevated, where you had a nonviolent movement that brought about the reunification of Germany and end the unipolar world. Why don't we take the industrial power of Germany and the West and spread it to the East and launch a whole program of economic development? They called it the Eurasian, the triangle first, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, but then expanding that East, expanding that South. And instead, I remember very vividly H.W. Bush and Maggie Thatcher, Bush vehemently opposing this. In fact, I remember him whining and saying, "You won't see me dancing on the Berlin Wall." And what they did is they set out a series of geopolitical adventures to totally sabotage the potential that had opened up. The Balkans, the Iraq War, anything, and shock therapy, looting the former republics, with Jeffrey Sachs, who is saying some useful things now, probably for his own ends. I'm not sure he's particularly a very good person, but what did they run? This horrible shock therapy, which led to the population of Russia shrinking by about 1 million people per year. The black market, drug addiction, alcoholism, frankly, a lot of what we're seeing in the United States today, but it was a deliberate policy of sabotaging the moment of opportunity.
Dennis?
I think there's something very interesting here Scott is talking about, and it also causes me to think back to the period. I was also very active with Lyndon LaRouche at that time as well, but I remember something very specific about the 83 through 88 period. Of course, there was a lot of tumult that was characteristic, but there were these discussions involving Gorbachev and Reagan around what was referenced before, the Strategic Defense Initiative. They were contentious. A lot of things that could be said, but certainly there was a dialogue process that was happening at that point. Now, Russia and Soviet Union then was having a lot of economic problems. And one of the elements was, could this emphasis on new forms of, as we called it then, new physical principles, because laser weapons were different than nuclear weapons. And the idea was to take the pressure off the domestic economies, both of the United States and the Soviet Union, because you had these nuclear weapons, they were very expensive. And in fact, a crash program could have changed the relationship. This didn't get adopted. And in 88, November of 80, it was October of 88. At that time, it was a big problem with food production in the Soviet Union. And what LaRouche proposed at that time was, what if we have a combination of Soviet Union, United States works together on developing Poland. We look at the possibilities of reunification. And these were things that at the time when you talked about them, people thought they were crazy. They thought these were things were completely impossible. Now, I wonder, and this is partially, I'm going to pose this to you, Scott, because you have a short period of time with this. I would pose something here. I'm thinking about George Bush. I'm thinking about George Bush's relationship to Reagan. I'm thinking about the contention that was there from the very beginning. Remember, because Reagan did not actually want Bush originally as the vice presidential candidate. He was very much against him. Of course, Bush was hardcore CIA. A lot of things were going on underneath there, with the Iran-Contra deal and all these sorts of things. And in the second Reagan administration, between 84 and 88, there were some pretty big changes for the worse. And I just wonder what your view is of the relationship between Bush, what he did, because as you know, they were the big triumphalists, the famous 520 committee with him and Cheney and Wolfowitz and all those guys having the discussion about the unipolar world. That's when they made the decision, right? Team A and Team B. Right? And they had these discussions that were going on. So I just wonder what your view is of that period, 88, 89, 90, in terms of how the guys like Bush and others would have screwed up the promise of what might have been impossible then.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. I was very junior at that time. I was a Marine Corps captain operating at the ground level. I can't claim to have sat in the halls of power, but there's a man that I met while I was in the Soviet Union, and I've developed a friendship with him since, named Jack Matlock. He was the ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union. And he's not just a diplomat, he's a scholar. He's somebody who knows Russia inside and out culturally, linguistically, historically. And Matlock continuously advocated for the Bush administration to act more aggressively to take advantage of the opportunities that Gorbachev had created through perestroika. Gorbachev basically jumped off a cliff without a parachute on the premise that the United States was going to come down and somehow put one on his back while he was falling to the ground. He started some things under Reagan, but then Reagan left. And there was hope that, at least in the Soviet Union, on the part of Gorbachev and his inner circle, that Bush would continue these policies. But Bush hit the big pause, and they had to have the giant CIA-driven, relook at American policy towards the Soviet Union. And all the while, Gorbachev's free falling. It was, it just got worse during that time. He was desperate. He needed this treaty, the START treaty. And Bush just kept hitting pause, pause, pause. Gorbachev bent over backwards to help the United States during the Gulf War, even though the Soviet Union was friendly with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. The Soviet Union went along with the United Nations formation of a coalition to forcefully evict Saddam from Kuwait. But the idea was that this was going to be part of a new world order where people would work together, not in harmony, sounds too kumbaya-ish, but work together towards a common objective. But the United States had no intention of working together with anybody. The United States only had the intention of leading. And Matlock believes that this was a fatal flaw, that this helped create, this helped, our failure to act decisively in engaging with Gorbachev left wide open a variety of doors that were taken by the forces inside the Soviet Union who were opposed to Gorbachev to overthrow. We talk about the economy. I was a weapons inspector in Vodkinsk. Vodkinsk was a military city, singularly, not singular, nothing's ever singular. They had a radio enterprise, they had oil and gas industries, but the big player in town was the Vodkinsk Production Association, missile builders. And under the INF Treaty, we got rid of their biggest moneymaker, the SS-20. I mean, they were cranking those babies out 60 to 80 a year. They had a new generation coming. They were looking for another 10, 12 years of money-making principle out of this. They had the SS-12, a really good advanced system. That was eliminated. They eliminated short-range missiles like the SS-23, made at Vodkinsk. So Vodkinsk lost overnight literally more than 50%, almost 60% of their money-generating capability. They had two things left, the SS-25, which was an ICBM, and then they had something called the Courier system. It was a short-range, a small ICBM. And the industrialists, the military industrialists, really wanted this small ICBM missile. They wanted it to make a point to the United States that you can't just boss us around from a strategic arms reduction treaty thing, that we can play this game too. You need to come to the table seriously. And they also needed it from an industrial standpoint. The promise to the citizens of Vodkinsk, and by extension, the citizens of the Soviet Union, who overwhelmingly were linked to defense industry, that we will not abandon you, that we will continue to create systems that give you a paycheck, a viable standard of living, the hope for a future. Gorbachev killed that missile. He killed that missile because he believed it could threaten the START treaty. The START treaty that Bush didn't want to sign, that wasn't rushing into. So Gorbachev was seen by many people as sacrificing the national security and the economic integrity of the Soviet Union in pursuit of the false promise of disarmament that the United States was never serious about. And, in the story of the Courier missile isn't well known. That's why I wrote a book about it called Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. That's my plug for the book. I don't want to be seen as, too much of that, but I did write the book and I did tell that story. And it's an important part because when Gorbachev signed off on the memorandum terminating the Courier, that was literally the straw that broke the camel's back. That memorandum was put in. Yazov said, the board called in Khrushchev. They had the emergency committee, and they had the coup. So there's a direct cause and effect relationship between the killing of that missile program and the decision to launch a coup. It wasn't the only reason behind the coup. I mean, Gorbachev was threatening to fire all the people on the committee. He was, there was a whole bunch of other issues that were at stake there, but it was literally the straw that broke the camel's back. But no, getting back to your original premise, I don't know if George Herbert Walker Bush could have saved Gorbachev. I don't know, because there was a lot of problems inside the Soviet Union that he was facing. There was a lot of opposition. Gorbachev was Mr. Democracy, but as he continued down the path towards the unilateral presidency that he was pursuing, one which was not elected but selected, which irritated a lot of people. who said, if you want to be president, then you have to be elected like everybody else. And he was like, no, I'm going to be selected by the very system I'm seeking to remove. Because Gorbachev was, at the end of the day, like most politicians, a narcissist, a man who believes in his singular ability to solve problems at the exclusion of others. And so I don't know if he could have been saved, but I do believe that the chaos that came after the collapse of the Soviet Union could have been mitigated with the United States being invested in a positive manner in the stabilization of the Soviet Union and what came afterwards. Instead, we seem to be oblivious to what we were doing. And maybe, again, the CIA being, I mean, I read the CIA assessments at the time, and I don't see any conspiracy theory to undermine the Soviet Union. I see a lot of people confused about what's happening and concerned about what's happening, but not this grand conspiracy to undermine. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, different story altogether. We didn't care about it. We hadn't invested ourselves into the future of these people and these systems. And instead, we went into pure 100% selfish exploitation mode. And this could, I believe, that mindset could have been different had Bush actually followed Jack Matlock's advice and engaged early on in a positive manner with Mikhail Gorbachev to try and help him create the conditions for perestroika to succeed. Because the fact is, the policies of the Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush, when you look at it today, and I write about it in the book, they seem to be more through neglect. They allowed the Soviet Union to collapse. I mean, they did not do the steps necessary to help Gorbachev succeed, and they stepped back, and through neglect, through ignoring Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, they sat by and let it collapse. I don't know if they could have saved it, but when you see somebody drowning, at least throw them a life preserver. We didn't even do that.
Well, we just have a few more minutes. Diane, do you have any final words?
Well, I think we should learn from the idiotic things that we've done in the past. We have to completely change the relationship of the United States to the rest of the world. And I actually really appreciated what Scott asked at the end of that interview we had before, which is if anyone can think of one significant good thing that the United States is doing in the world. And that's not because we hate the United States. The United States had a unique role. We defeated the British Empire, partly spurred because we knew what the Brits were doing in India, what they later did in Ireland. And it wasn't so that we could be like them, it was so we could be different from them. If you read John Quincy Adams, or you understand, actually, my husband is now working on a very interesting project and discovering that Ben Franklin had an extremely close relationship to Russia and Russian scientists. So we have to change our thinking about how we relate to the rest of the world. And frankly, the United States will only benefit. I think people can agree we are not benefiting right now from our sanctions policy and the policy of demonizing other nations, particularly big ones like Russia and China.
Dennis, do you have any final words?
I think that the thing I'd like to say, I mean, I have a much different view of Gorbachev. I think I disagree with Scott about what went on here, but I don't disagree about the following. A proposal was made to go beyond nuclear weapons. There were some people in the Soviet Union that wanted to respond, and there were others that, they did not want to see that go ahead. And there were people in the United States, emphatically, that did not want to see that go ahead. And I believe that what happened in the Soviet Union over that period, from the first Reagan administration through the second, is that a fatal decision in the wrong direction was made. And that therefore, whenever you try to make political changes, but you don't have the economic capability, especially working with an adversary, which is sort of what JFK was all about when he was talking at that time about a joint program between the Soviet Union and America. I think that's what the lesson is to look at here. I think this is a real tragedy, and it bears a lot more discussion.
And on that note, Scott's got to leave in like 3 minutes. So thank you, Diane. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Scott. And we will continue this conversation. Everybody have a great day. Thank you for listening, and anybody that's listening, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.